Hello, my friend. Come sit with me for a while. Tonight I want to talk about something we rarely celebrate, even though we should. Not victory, not the trophy raised over someone's head while the crowd loses its voice. Tonight is about the harder skill, the one almost nobody masters. Knowing the exact moment to stop, and having the nerve to do it while everyone is still begging you to stay. This is the story of a boy from a cracked concrete courtyard in the south of France. A boy whose name would eventually be projected in letters 20 feet tall onto the most famous stone monument in Europe. This is the story of Zinedine Zidane. Let me take you somewhere first, not to a stadium, to a housing estate on the northern edge of Marseille, a cluster of tall, tired apartment blocks called La Castellane, built in the 1950s to house workers nobody had really planned for. Laundry hangs between balconies. The wind off the Mediterranean carries salt and diesel fumes in equal measure. Down at ground level, between two blocks, there is a flat stretch of asphalt, just big enough for a football match, if you do not mind playing around a lamppost and a row of parked mopeds. Everyone here simply calls it the place. It has no other name. It does not need one. The family that would eventually produce a World Cup winner did not begin in France at all. Zinedine's parents were Kabyle, an indigenous Berber people from the rugged mountains of northern Algeria, from a village so small and so remote that for a long time it did not appear on ordinary maps at all. Life there was defined by hard soil, short growing seasons, and almost no paid work. In the early 1950s, with Algeria still under French colonial rule and its economy offering the family almost nothing, Zinedine's father crossed the sea looking for wages he could send home. He found work first as a labourer, later settling permanently in Marseille, where he eventually took a steady but unglamorous job as a night watchman, guarding a warehouse while the rest of the city slept. 7 people shared 4 small rooms in that apartment above the courtyard I mentioned. Space was tight enough that mealtimes had to be organised in shifts, the younger children eating first at a table too small for the whole family at once. The father ran the household with a discipline that bordered on severity, not out of coldness, but out of something closer to fear on behalf of his children. A fear that the wrong attitude, the wrong laziness, could cost them everything in a country that did not always make immigrants feel welcome. He is remembered by those who knew him as a man who repeated one lesson to his children constantly, in one form or another, that a family like theirs did not get to coast, that whatever the neighbours could achieve through comfort or connections, his own children would have to earn through sheer stubborn effort, doubled. Zinedine, the youngest of 5, was by most accounts a quiet, watchful child, more comfortable observing a room than commanding it. School interested him only mildly. What interested him, from the moment he could walk properly, was the ball bouncing off the walls of the courtyard below his window. He would beg to go down and play with his older brothers long before he was considered old enough, and when he finally was allowed to join, something in the way he moved among bigger, rougher boys set him apart almost immediately. A stillness in his upper body paired with feet that seemed to already know where the ball was going before it got there. His brothers, older by several years each, played a quiet but important role in shaping him during this period. It was one of them who first pushed him into a proper match at the local club, rather than letting him linger forever on the courtyard. And it was another who, according to family friends, gave him a nickname that stuck around the neighbourhood long before the wider world ever heard the name Zidane at all. A nickname built simply on the way he darted between larger boys without ever seeming to touch them. Football in a place like La Castellane was rarely framed as a path toward wealth or fame. For most families there, it was simply something to do that kept children out of far more dangerous trouble on the streets after school. Nobody around him, least of all the boy himself, imagined at the time that a courtyard game between parked cars was actually a kind of laboratory, quietly producing the balance and spatial awareness that would later look, on a professional pitch, almost supernatural. By 9, He had joined an amateur club nearby and was quickly made captain of his age group, a fairly ordinary achievement for a talented boy in a footballing city like Marseille, where thousands of children dream the exact same dream every single year. What was not ordinary was what happened when he was 14 at a regional talent camp organized to give scouts a look at the region's most promising young players. One of the scouts present that week was a man in his late 60s named Varu, a veteran talent spotter for a club up the coast who had actually come to evaluate a completely different boy, one whose name has since been mostly forgotten by history. That other boy, for reasons lost to time, was left out of the final exhibition match. Varu, tired after a long week of travel, seriously considered leaving before it even started. He stayed anyway, more out of professional habit than any real expectation. And in that final match, a thin, quiet boy, wearing a shirt slightly too big for him, began doing something Varu had rarely seen from a player that age. He received the ball calmly under pressure, shielded it with his body rather than panicking, and slipped past defender after defender using nothing but small shifts of weight and perfectly timed changes of pace. Varu would later describe the sensation as watching someone speak a language fluently that everyone else on the pitch was still struggling to translate. That night, from a payphone in a nearly empty train station, he called his club and insisted, almost urgently, that they sign the boy before anyone else noticed him. The move north to the academy was hard on Zinedine in ways that rarely make it into the highlight reels of his career. He was homesick constantly, still a child in most of the ways that matter, thrown into a dormitory full of boys from backgrounds very different from his own. His temper, which had simmered quietly under the surface for years, occasionally broke through, and there was at least one documented incident of a fistfight with another trainee that led to a period of unglamorous punishment, cleaning the locker rooms and scrubbing the showers long after the other boys had gone home. Varu, who kept a kind of informal guardianship over him during these early years, is remembered by former colleagues as the man who first tried to redirect that anger rather than simply punish it, encouraging the boy to channel whatever frustration he carried onto the pitch itself rather than into his fists. The lesson, whatever form it actually took, seems to have worked, slowly and imperfectly, the way most real lessons do. He made his professional debut at 17, and within a decade he had become one of the most sought-after midfielders on the continent, eventually moving to Italy in the mid-1990s to play for one of the most storied clubs in the world, where his reputation grew from promising to genuinely elite. By 1998, when France was preparing to host the World Cup on home soil for the first time in over 60 years, he had become the creative heartbeat of the national team, even if the wider public had not yet fully understood the scale of what he was capable of. That summer remains, even now, one of the most emotionally loaded chapters in French sporting history. The country had waited generations for a World Cup, let alone one played in its own stadiums, and the pressure on the team bordered on suffocating. France ground through the tournament with a mixture of stubborn defending and moments of brilliance, eliminating Italy and then Croatia to reach a final nobody outside France genuinely expected them to win. Their opponent was Brazil, the reigning champions, a team many considered close to unbeatable on paper. Getting to that final had not been easy either. In the semi-final against Croatia, a tournament revelation that had eliminated Germany in the previous round, France had trailed for long stretches before a late surge carried them through, and the team's captain, a steady, unglamorous midfielder named Didier Deschamps, had reportedly spent the days before the final reminding his more gifted teammate that talent alone rarely won finals, that someone still had to be brave enough to actually take the responsibility when the moment arrived. On the 12th of July, in a stadium just north of Paris built specifically for the occasion, France and Brazil walked out in front of a crowd that had waited a lifetime for this exact night. 27 minutes in, a corner swung into the box, and Zidane, timing his run perfectly between two defenders, rose and directed a firm, precise header past the goalkeeper. Just before half-time, another corner, another header, this time completely unmarked, doubling the lead. A third goal in the second half sealed it beyond doubt. France had won its first World Cup, 4-0, and the man who had scored both goals that mattered was a shy boy from a Marseille housing block whose own parents had crossed a sea decades earlier looking for nothing more than steady work. That night in Paris has since become the stuff of legend on its own terms. Strangers embraced in the street. Traffic simply stopped functioning as drivers abandoned their cars to dance. Both French and Algerian flags appeared together in windows across the city, an image loaded with meaning in a country still working through decades of complicated colonial history. And onto the great triumphal arch at the western end of the city, an enormous illuminated portrait of Zidane's face was projected, with two words glowing beside it that would follow him for the rest of his career. "Thank you, Zizou." The years that followed brought an almost uninterrupted string of individual and team success. A European Championship title with France in 2000, multiple selections as the best player on the planet, and in 2001, a transfer to Real Madrid that broke every existing record for a single player's price tag. A fee so large that newspapers across Europe spent weeks simply arguing about whether any footballer could possibly be worth it. He answered that question, at least partially, less than a year later, in a Champions League final played in Glasgow against a German opponent, when a looping cross drifted in from the left side of the pitch, and rather than bring the ball down under control, the way convention demanded, he met it clean out of the air with his weaker foot, a strike so pure and so improbable that commentators struggled, in the moment, to find the right words at all. That single goal is still shown, more than 2 decades later, whenever anyone tries to define what the phrase "perfect technique" is supposed to mean. By the middle of the following decade, the toll of nearly 2 full decades at the top of the sport had begun to show. His knees ached constantly. Training sessions that used to feel effortless now required careful management. In the spring of 2006, in a conversation with teammates that several of them later described in interviews, he made clear, quietly and without drama, that his playing career would end once the upcoming World Cup was finished, regardless of how the tournament itself went. When his club's leadership, alarmed at the thought of losing their biggest asset, offered to essentially let him name his own terms to stay, he turned it down without much hesitation, telling those present that he had simply given the game everything he had left to give. That summer's World Cup, held across Germany, briefly looked like it might deliver him the perfect farewell his body and his pride both seemed to deserve. France advanced steadily, and in the knockout rounds, Zidane produced some of the most composed, almost serene football of his entire career, guiding a team that had looked ordinary in the group stage into the final itself. Along the way, France defeated the same Brazilian side that had once been the standard against which all other teams were measured, with Zidane converting the decisive penalty himself, a small, quiet echo of 1998 that few watching could have missed. The final, played in Berlin against Italy on the 9th of July, opened almost immediately in his favour. A cheeky, audacious penalty chipped down the middle of the goal inside the first 10 minutes. Italy levelled things before half-time, and the match dragged into extra time, still locked at 1 goal apiece, both sides visibly exhausted. And then, in the 110th minute, with the entire footballing world watching a match that would decide the single most prestigious trophy in the sport, something happened that no highlight reel of his career could ever fully explain away. Walking upfield alongside an opposing defender he had already clashed with earlier in the match, words were exchanged that neither man would fully clarify in public for years afterward, though the defender eventually admitted the remark had concerned Zidane's family. Zidane stopped walking. He turned, and in front of what was, at the time, one of the largest television audiences in the history of the sport, he drove his forehead into the other man's chest with tremendous force, sending him sprawling to the grass. The referee had not seen the incident directly, but a fourth official watching on a monitor had, and within moments the red card was raised. The single greatest player of his generation was ordered off the pitch in the last match he would ever play. In a World Cup final he was supposed to be lifting. He walked the long distance to the tunnel in near silence, passing within a few feet of the trophy itself without turning his head toward it even once. France lost the final on penalties shortly afterward. For the only time in a career defined by choosing his own moments, the ending had been chosen for him, and it was an ending he would carry, by his own later admission, with real discomfort for years to come. For a long stretch afterward, Zidane retreated almost entirely from public life, spending time with his family in Madrid, rarely appearing in football media at all, seemingly content to let the game move on without him. Then, in 2013, he returned to his old club, but in a role nobody expected. Not as a celebrated ambassador or a figurehead, but as a working assistant coach, doing the unglamorous groundwork of professional football. Former staff at the training ground have recalled, in interviews since, that he was frequently the first person to arrive each morning, laying out cones and marking training zones himself, long before the rest of the coaching staff or players appeared. A small, almost invisible discipline from a man who had once been the most famous athlete on the planet. A year later came another modest step. Head coach of the club's reserve side, working with teenagers and fringe players most fans had never heard of, a job with none of the glamour his name might have commanded elsewhere. He did not lobby for anything bigger. He simply worked, the same quiet, doubled effort his father had once demanded of him as a boy. Then, in January 2016, with the senior team's form collapsing and the fan base openly furious, the club's president made a decision that startled almost everyone in European football. He handed the top job to a man with barely a season of senior coaching experience anywhere. Skeptics were not shy about their doubts. Too calm, some said. Too inexperienced. Too much reputation and not enough tactical pedigree. What followed silenced almost all of them within months. In his first partial season in charge, he won the Champions League. The following season, he won it again, becoming the first manager in decades to retain the trophy in successive years. The season after that, he won it a third consecutive time, a feat unmatched in the modern era of European football and last achieved, in a different footballing age entirely, by a legendary German club more than 4 decades earlier. Asked repeatedly how a man with so little coaching experience could achieve something no one else had managed in 40 years, his own explanation stayed remarkably consistent across dozens of interviews. He did not present himself as a tactical innovator or a master of complex systems. His gift, he suggested, lay somewhere else entirely. In understanding footballers as people first, having spent nearly 2 decades himself inside locker rooms full of enormous egos and fragile confidence, learning firsthand what made talented, wealthy, famous young men actually want to run themselves into the ground for a manager they respected. His dressing room during those years contained an extraordinary concentration of global superstars, and by nearly every account from the players themselves, he managed that room not through fear or rigid hierarchy, but through a quiet, personal attentiveness that made each one of them feel individually understood rather than simply managed as a group. By the spring of 2018, he stood once again at the very summit of the sport, having just guided his club to a 3rd consecutive European title, an achievement that made him, almost overnight, one of the most successful coaches of his generation. And then, only days later, he called a press conference that stunned the football world, nearly as much as the headbutt in Berlin once had, though for the opposite reason. Sitting beside the club's visibly uneasy president, he announced, calmly and without any external pressure forcing his hand, that he would be stepping down as coach, effective immediately, at the very peak of his success. He explained that both club and coach sometimes need fresh energy precisely when things are going well, rather than waiting for decline to force the decision instead. It was, in its own quiet way, the ending Berlin had denied him 12 years earlier, finally claimed on his own terms, with no red card and no long, silent walk past a trophy he could not bring himself to look at. There is one more strange, almost poetic chapter worth mentioning from the middle of his playing career. In 2005, two artists were given permission to train an extraordinary number of cameras on him during a single ordinary league match in Madrid, recording nothing but his own movements across the full 90 minutes, ignoring the ball whenever it was elsewhere on the pitch. The resulting film became something closer to a meditation than a sports documentary, following the small, constant adjustments of a footballer's body when no camera anywhere else was paying attention. The walking, the glancing, the almost imperceptible positioning that happens between the moments highlight reels usually bother to show. It remains one of the strangest and most respected pieces of filmmaking ever made about an athlete, precisely because it was never really about the goals at all. His own sons, several of whom grew up absorbing that same instinct for the game almost by osmosis, went on to play professionally themselves, one of them eventually representing the very same academy system in Madrid that had once taken their father in as a frightened, homesick 14-year-old from Marseille. A small, quiet continuation of the same story carried one generation further forward. A boy born into a crowded apartment above a concrete courtyard, the son of parents who had crossed a sea with almost nothing, grew into a man who scored 2 goals with his forehead to win his country its first World Cup, who later drove that same forehead into another man's chest in the sport's biggest possible moment, and who ultimately learned through years of quiet, unglamorous work, far from any spotlight, the one lesson his own explosive temper had once made impossible: that leaving well, on your own terms, while everything is still going right, might be the single hardest and most valuable skill any of us ever learn. He once described his own identity in 3 layers, each one true at once: a Kabyle from the courtyards of Marseille, an Algerian by blood and by memory, and a Frenchman by the accident and the fortune of where he was born. He never fully let go of any of those 3 layers, and perhaps that constant awareness of where he came from is exactly what taught him, eventually, to recognize where he needed to go next, and when it was finally time to stop. My friend, somewhere in your own life, there is probably a door like that too. Something going reasonably well that some quiet, honest part of you already suspects has run its course. Most of us wait for that door to be slammed shut for us, the way Berlin was slammed shut on him in 2006. Very few of us learn to close it ourselves, calmly, while it is still open, while everyone around us is still asking us to stay. That, more than any header or any volley, might be the truest measure of what made this particular man remarkable.